they couldn't have it anymore. That's the principle of scarcity. We desire that which is rare or dwindling.
And it's a very beneficial class simply because it gives you several other ways of actually persuading customers or persuading other employees to a certain way of thinking.
Oh yeah, matter of fact, that's one of the other amplifiers we'll see is publicity. When other people know when we've made commitments, that's extremely powerful.
Dan is an incredibly high-energy guy who brings a lot of power and conviction to the presentation and truly had me motivated. And that's saying something since I've been around a while and done a lot of this myself. So I wanted to thank Dan and just to comment on his extremely professional presentation.
Welcome to the presentation on the science of influence. Today, what we're going to talk about is that actual psychology, the actual science of influence. How do people cause others to become more likely to agree, and most importantly, do so ethically? And when I say science, I literally mean science. It's not going to be about my opinions or some conjecture or what I did in a certain industry or anything of that nature. What we're going to expose you to today is the actual science of influence that's been validated all over the world. What my role is to work with some of the leading scientists in the world, like Dr. Robert Cialdini, Dr. Greg Neidert, and others, to help bring the research out of the laboratory and into the workplace. We influence people on a regular basis in our homes, at work, all these different places, but no one ever really shows us or communicates to us what is the science behind it. And what you'll find with the research that we're going to show you here today is that small changes make significantly big changes. It's not just a big change. It's as small as a couple of words can dramatically affect how people view your request. It doesn't require coercion, threat, force, intimidation, or anything else to work. What they found is that it is a tool that anyone can use regardless of their power, regardless of where they are in an industry. Matter of fact, they did a recent study in North America, and they found that the most effective managers spend at least 80% of their time trying to influence and persuade others. It's based on scientific principles. Now, another thing you'll find is that this workshop focuses on a vast body of evidence from two primary sources. The first is over 50 years of research all over the globe. A show of hands, how many of you are finding yourselves working with different cultures that you had not grown up with? Yeah, these scientific principles are effective wherever you go, whether it's in Latin America or Asia or Africa or anywhere else. These are fundamental human behaviors. And I'm going to show you several of the research studies that demonstrate how these principles work. From Dr. Robert Cialdini's own systemic study. He's got over 30 years of experience in this, and he's also the seminal authority on the subject. And what was interesting about his work is that he actually left the academic world for 3 years and infiltrated sales organizations and political organizations, religious groups, cults, anything he could find that tried to influence others. And what he wanted to find out is if there were universal principles that said this is how people make their decisions, then we'd really know something. And what he found is there were 6. No matter what the influence approach, no matter where he was at, there were 6 basic principles of influence that everyone used. And so every influence approach was a combination of one of those 6. Reciprocity, that feeling we have to give back to those who've given to us. The first principle of influence. I like to open these up by talking about a principle or a story or a mystery that really demonstrates this. Let me ask you, what was life like in Ethiopia in 1985? Terrible, wasn't it? It was horrible. Starvation, civil war, oppression, drought. The Ethiopian Red Cross sent thousands of dollars to Mexico to help relieve the suffering of the people involved in the Mexico City earthquake. Would that surprise you? Yeah, you're not the only ones. Some journalists wanted to find out, how could you make that decision? And so they tracked down the leader of the Red Cross, the director, and they said, well, you have such knowledge of what's going on here. How could you make this choice when you have all this need here? And what he said really underscored this principle. He said, The reason we did this is because in 1935, and think about that, 50 years before, in 1935, when we were invaded by Italy, Mexico came to our aid. They came to help us out. They gave us food and ammunition and weapons. So we wanted to be there for them in their time of need. And that demonstrates this power of reciprocity. Psychologically, people are obliged to give back to those who have given to them. And the key is to provide the gift or concession first, because that stimulates the long-term profitable exchange. You have to be the first to give. It speaks to the wisdom of the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What's more persuasive? A gift or a reward? In other words, is it more persuasive to say, hey, I'll give you X if you give me Y? Or is it more persuasive to just simply say, here's X? There's consensus, the psychology that states we tend to do what many others are doing. When our mothers and fathers told us years ago that they asked us, well, if all the other kids in the neighborhood jumped off a cliff, would you? Research says probably. More so than just loan others, we are influenced by people who are similar to us. So think about some of the things that you've used in the past to influence others. We're from here. That's why that's so powerful. Because if that's your target market, you're getting a good bang for your buck in terms of similarity. The same thing goes when we're trying to influence others. Are we telling them or illustrating for them how people like them would behave? Here's how people like you would do this. Many others like you would make this choice. There's also one other thing that really causes this to be amplified. There's another principle, and this principle is called authority. And just like the others, I want to give you an idea of how this principle can work. We rely on those with superior knowledge and wisdom for guidance on how we should respond. And it's a source of influence that comes from being an authority, not being in authority. The authority principle is activated by cues that communicates one's status as a legitimate authority. You know, what communicates that people are actually knowledgeable? You know, and it can be a lot of things. It can be the way that we dress. It can be our body language. I mean, it can be a lot of different things. You know, there are other cues, and some of them aren't fair. So for us, one of the ways we can leverage that expertise is not to tell people how much we know, but to give people examples of our experience. You know, we had a salesperson we recently worked with about a year and a half ago. She's told us that every month she has a sustainable increase in 100% of her sales. 100% of her sales. And it came only from authority. The only change she made is instead of telling people what they should buy, she would say this. Consistency. Once we make a statement, once we go on the record, we will tend to be very consistent with what we've said or done. Psychologically, once people make a choice, once they take a stand, they will encounter significant personal and interpersonal pressure with what they've previously done. You know, once we've gone on the record, we will tend to be very consistent with that. So for us, what we want to do is influence people to make a commitment. This is the activator. Getting people to actively commit to something, taking a stand on an issue, you know, a prior stance, or telling you what they think, feel, or believe. And what's the best way of getting a commitment? This is a really nice restaurant in the Chicago area. It's a 5-star restaurant. And let me ask you, do restaurants that are 5-star, these really nice ones, do they tend to do business by walk-ins or reservations? Reservations. And they had a 30% no-show rate. So when people would call in, you know, 30% of them wouldn't show. So they had these empty tables and customers that they would turn away because they thought their books were full. They would say, please call us if you can't make it. Please call us if you can't make it. They added 2 words to that decreased no-shows by 300%. What 2 words do you think they could have added? Scarcity. We want that which we can't have. Or if something appears rare, we want it even more. They did a cafeteria food study. They asked students to tell them, how do you think the cafeteria food tastes? Yeah, yucky, horrible. I wouldn't feed this to my dog. It's inhuman that you feed this to us. And just horrible. I didn't like it. They couldn't stand the food. Well, they did something just 10 days later that caused the students to rate it from poor and terrible and awful to highly desirable. And what do you think they could have changed in those 10 days? Let me give you what they call the Nabisco cookie study. And what's interesting about this study is, had a company known about this, they could have saved themselves billions of dollars. This study could have prevented what they called the worst marketing debacle of last century. Now, before I tell you what that is, let me give you the idea how the study works. But I share that with you because scarcity doesn't change how we view a product or what the product factors are. What it changes is our desirability for it. Now, let me give you an example of how that cost billions of dollars for a company. The principle of liking. We tend to buy and be influenced by people we know and like. But what many people don't know is that's just as easy to bungle away. And liking is one that few people will argue with, and that is, people prefer to say yes to those we know and like. We like to say yes to people we know and like. And the reason is because we trust them. What people don't know is complete strangers can activate this principle to create those same intense feelings of liking that people have had with friends for years. Praise produces liking. We like those who like us, and most importantly, tell us so. You know, when people come up and say, hey, you did a great job, we're like, wow, you're awesome. And as a matter of fact, they've done some interesting studies. One with a gentleman named Joe Girard. And Joe Girard is in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most effective automobile salesman on the planet. And one of the things that they found interesting about Joe is that, on average, most people sell 1 to 2 automobiles per week. In his case, he sells anywhere from 8 to 15. It's a huge amount. And so researchers wanted to find out, what do you do? And he told them, I do 2 things. 1, I give them a fair price, but 2, ask yourselves, how can we leverage this? If you have a tough scenario or a really difficult coaching session, how can I use reciprocity? How can I use consensus? And it will definitely help you out like it's helped many others out. And if you walk away with nothing else, I'd like you to consider this. The difference between an effective influence approach and one that almost as effective is often the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. Folks, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure being here.